So for this week, it's a second part of a series related to what's happening to wildlife and creatures in our world. And last week we had a story of what you might call slow moving but rapidly disappearing animals, the turtles and tortoises. And the outcome of that was they are in big trouble, rapidly getting in bigger trouble, and it's largely a human mediated problem. And it was interesting that the word climate was not mentioned at all, except in the questions at the end. And today, I think we may have a different view of what's going on. So we're going to shift from the sort of global issue of a group that's going extinct everywhere to some issues that are right here in our own backyard. In fact, started with studies right here on campus. And this is related to some of the institutions we have, in particular museums, which preserve our history in many ways. And I believe it was last year we introduced the issue or the program that started in the early 1900s in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, where the director then, Grinnell, went out and surveyed habitats in the Sierras and all remote parts of California. And we're going to return to that today with a more updated and broader view of it, I think. So our speaker, Steve Beissinger, is currently a professor of ecology and conservation biology here at Berkeley. He's also a research associate in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology that I mentioned. He joined the faculty in 1996 after something like 8 years at Yale University. So since coming to Berkeley, he has been the Starker-Leopold Chair in Wildlife Biology. He served as the chair of the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, and he's now the co-director of the Berkeley Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity. He's also directs the Grinnell resurvey project, which I'm going to let him talk more about. But just to give you an idea of his background, I've always known Steve as an ornithologist. He's my go-to ornithologist on campus. Whenever I have a bird question, I'll ask Steve. And his research, though, is much broader than that in many ways, interested on challenges at a larger scale facing conservation and society. And it's notable that he's been involved in these long-term studies. He works on a group of parrot-like small parrots, parrotlets, in Venezuela for over 30 years, which is one of the longest running studies of a tropical bird. And these long-term perspectives are rather unique in biology, where publish or perish usually makes you finish much faster than that. And so today he's going to return to this Grinnell survey project, and I think I'll let Steve tell you about it. So Steve, please.
All right, thank you, Paul. Let me share my screen. And there we go. Are you seeing my first slide? I hope so.
Yes, it's all great.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. Usually I get these ornithology questions, sometimes just from people in the general public that want to know something, and they, of course, look at the CAL faculty interests and somehow they come up with my name, and then it's usually stump the chump at that point. You know, birds are one of the things that got me interested in being outdoors. And this project that I'll talk to you about today, the Grinnell Resurvey project, has been a wonderful way to combine sort of the history, both that CAL has been involved in, but also to be able to understand long-term change here in California. And as Paul said, I've been involved in a number of long-term studies This is the shortest of my long-term studies, and I'll tell you about it. I'm going to tell you mostly about the more recent work, but in transformed landscapes. This is not a transformed landscape very much. This is Lassen Volcanic National Park in Northern California. But the picture sort of tells you the story about the project. And let me give you just a little bit of setting first. As Paul alluded, there really are two major global changes. There's lots of other things that are changing too, but land use and climate change are probably the biggest changes that have taken place. You know, we do have exotic diseases that move through. We do have pollution that takes place, but across the scale of the globe, there's hardly a place untouched by one or the other of these two things. And you look at this, I think most of us know what land use change really is and what it's caused by. It's really transforming natural areas into uses for agriculture, urban, or some other human endeavor. Climate change was something a little bit more recent. We understand it as heat trapping gases and water vapor in the atmosphere that, as the energy comes in and gets reflected off the Earth's surface, doesn't escape the way it used to. And of course, there are multiple greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and CO2 is one of the big ones. And you can see through this figure here what's happened to our global land temperature. You know, on average in the globe, it's increased by 0.8 of a degree centigrade. You can see sort of the change from the long-term average going across here, and the global CO2 concentrations, long-term monitoring and study done in Mauna Loa in Hawaii that is often used to understand this change. And they're closely related. And usually the way that we often study these kinds of impacts on, say, wildlife or biodiversity is using a sort of space for time substitution. By that, I mean, we might take an organism like this golden mantle ground squirrel and find all the locations that are verified by, say, museum specimens or other resightings, all white here, and overlay climate layers on that and make a relationship with its current geographic range and, say, temperature relationships, rainfall, temperature in the coldest month, warmest month, some things like that would help us predict with some degree of confidence where the species is found and where it's not found. And then use standard, now we have standard scenarios for the future, depending upon how fast the greenhouse gases rise, different representative concentration pathways, as they're called, that go from less severe to very severe, and see where the species would likely be found by turning up the thermostat and maybe changing the precipitation patterns. And you can see that's what these kinds of models are used to predict. But they're a little bit hard to test, that kind of future forecasts. My road to thinking about the future of climate change has been to go in the other direction, the past, and to use actual measures of changes of the past that we're able to get as a result of the sort of forward thinking of the UC Berkeley's Museum of Vertebrate Zoology and Joseph Grinnell. So Grinnell was the first director of the museum. Annie Alexander, a very interesting story in her own right, an heiress to a pineapple fortune in Hawaii who moved as a young woman to Oakland, interested in studying natural history, came to CAL, took some classes and endowed the museum and picked Joseph Grinnell as the first director. And Grinnell had a vision, and that vision is sort of outlined in this quote that hung on the wall for many years outside of the Grinnell Memorial Library room. And what it says is, at this point, I wish to emphasize what I believe will ultimately prove to be the greatest purpose of our museum. This value will not, however, be realized until the lapse of many years, possibly a century, assuming that our material is safely preserved. And this is that the student of the future will have access to the original faunal record in California and the West, wherever we work now. This is Grinnell writing, 1910. He realizes that as he's building his museum of specimens that he's preparing there on the right, he's really also building a baseline of faunal conditions. And he's gifted that to us in California. And the student of the future, well, that was us. And where we work now, well, that was everywhere. Grinnell was a workaholic. Look at this map, and these are hotspots of specimens. The dark or the red colors are where lots of specimens were collected and sort of scaled by tens of specimens. And you can see he was working all over California. And he didn't just leave specimens, he left field notes, notebooks of field notes that he draconiously made all of his students take as well. And these field notes were sort of done under Grinnell's own method. And they kept track of what he saw every day, or how many small mammal traps they put out to catch the small mammals, what they collected, where they went, who they talked to, interesting natural history information. Grinnell himself was really enamored with the idea that where species were found, their distributions were shaped by climate, their ecological niche. And in fact, you know, the Grinnellian niche is sort of named after him. And so here you can see in these blue squares, these are transects. These are locations where he went from like the Central Valley up over the Sierras to see how the distribution of animals changed as the climate changed. And so that's where we started. But I often wondered, how did we get this done?
And I did all the driving.
This is Ward Russell.
And we never traveled 1 inch, but when he had that notebook open and writing notes. The whole time he was taking a bird census wherever we went. And we'd be sitting in camp and we'd both be skinning. Pretty soon he'd throw a rat over to me. He'd say, "Here, Russell, finish this one up." And he'd just throw me the skin and pick up his notebook and start writing. And he said over and over, he said, "Put it all down. You may not think it's important, but somebody may."
And that was us. We were that somebody. And so we began the Grinnell Resurvey project, sort of in honor of the centennial celebration in Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. And we began by repeating the Yosemite Transect that Grinnell had visited with his students and colleagues. And this is a 3,000 meter elevational change. And Grinnell's, it was a very heavily sampled, going from the Central Valley up over the peaks in Yosemite. And we were interested in finding out whether, with climate change, the distribution of mammals and birds had shifted upward. That's what we would have kind of expected. And, you know, the first publications we did showed that. And here you can see species aligned for those who use the lower and the mid elevations to the mid to high elevations. Those that expanded, that's the green, mostly expanding upward, some expanded down. Others whose geographic elevational ranges contracted, mostly upward, but some contracted from both directions. And then about half of these small mammals, their elevational ranges were pretty much the same as when Grinnell and his colleagues were surveying them. And this made for a good story about the expectations from climate change, that as things warmed up, we might expect species ranges to get pushed up the mountain. Well, what is missing from this simple cartoon is that there was a lot of heterogeneity. If we look at closely related species of the same genus of these small mammals, as indicated by the same colors, you can see that some of them were expanding upward while the same color was contracting, or nothing happening at all. And you can see this heterogeneity over here, which we couldn't really explain. And it only got worse when we went to Kings Canyon, Sequoia National Parks in the south, the Southern Sierras, and repeated those 3,000-meter transect elevations all the way close to the top of Mount Whitney. And we went to Lassen Volcanic National Park and repeated those up to the top of Mount Lassen. We found that some species were moving down, some were moving up, same species doing different things in different parts of its range. In fact, up in the northern part of the state there at Lassen, there was more evidence of downward movement than there was of upward movement. There was a lot of variability. And I guess in hindsight, we should have known this, because climate change, as it turns out in California, is really substantial and also really lumpy since Grinnell's time. If we look at what the climate was like, the mean temperature, the minimum temperature, or the yearly precipitation from the early part of the 1900s when he was most active and surveyed a lot of sites, to the time period just before and at the beginning of our project, you can see that where the greatest changes have been, it's quite variable across the state. And here, even in the Lassen Transect, we even have some cooling that took place in the northern area and more wetting. Whereas in the southern part of the state, you can see a lot of drying here in the Mojave Desert and lots of heating in the Mojave Desert. And so, in fact, it made us realize that some of the variation that we were seeing was really variation due to this tremendous variation that we see in the state as where climate is really changing and where it's changing the fastest. And so we thought, well, let's go to one of California's most transformed landscapes. This is going to be transformed by climate change. Let's go down to the Mojave Desert, where it's gotten hotter and drier. And so Grinnell et al., they left us photographs, they left us maps in those field notes. We were able to dig those out. It takes quite a bit of time. They were working in protected areas down there, just like they did mostly in the Sierras, Death Valley, Mojave National Preserve, Joshua Tree National Park. And most all of this work was being done well before there was evidence of climate change. Some places you can go to like this, and the habitat looks virtually the same. And Jim and Carol Patton, probably many of you know Jim Patton. He's a Professor Emeritus at CAL, Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, the mammal expert. Jim has been devoted to this project from the beginning, really sort of co-organizer with Craig Moritz and myself in redoing these mammal transects. And Jim led all the sampling in Death Valley and some in Mojave National Preserve. Colleagues at San Diego Natural History Museum worked with us as well. We use live traps like this one, and we do collect some specimens today. Grinnell et al. Were surveying down in this region. They were using snap traps, museum specials, as they're called, because they were building this collection. And I think if there's something the student of the future will wish we had done more of, and that would probably be collecting more specimens, because specimens themselves are great environmental samplers. The bird surveys were sort of done by everybody in the Grinnell party. They were multitasking. They were keeping lists of what they saw every day. Sometimes they would do surveys along trails and tell us what they saw every hour. More frequently, they'd tell us a list of all the birds that they saw every day. Kelly Icknian, who was a PhD student in my lab, now a scientist for San Francisco Bay Estuary Institute, did the bird resurveys throughout the Mojave region. And we were tackling 61 sites, 135 species. There were over 90 mammal sites that we went to, fewer species. You can see across a range of different climates. So just one last word about methods. The there's a bunch of math on here. Just don't pay attention to that for a minute. Think about this. We go to a site that Grinnell, when we do our modern resurveys, and we visit it for a number of days in a row. Grinnell et al., they were doing their surveys, and they camped at a place and they surveyed around for a number of days. And so from the field notes, we can tell if at site 1, species A was detected in a given day, whether or not species B was detected. Nope, wasn't detected that day, but it was detected on the next day and wasn't on the third day, and so forth for all the species that they were surveying. And we go back to these same places. And our problem is that we never detect everything. We know that. And so we need to be able to correct for this difference in detectability. With the small mammals, it's not so big, but with the birds, we got bird guides and every vocalization, every call. And they didn't have those things. Oh, and we got great binoculars, stuff like that, that affects your detection probability. So we have to use statistical approaches, something called occupancy models, that help correct for these differences. So that, like here, over here, historically, if Grinnell saw a species at a site, and we saw a same species at the site, well, that would be good evidence of persistence. But if Grinnell saw it and we didn't, perhaps it persisted, perhaps it didn't. We would depend on what confidence we had in our detection probabilities. But what about this, where nobody detected a species? It could have been there originally, or in this case, I guess nobody detected the species and we detected it in our last visit. Does this represent a colonization? Possibly, but maybe it was there historically and maybe it persisted. That would depend upon the confidence in historic detection. So these methods try to correct for those things and help us in understanding the changes in occupancy. All right, let's look at the results. This is some yet not, well, some of this is off the presses, some of it isn't yet, but some fascinating results. We see really different changes for the small mammals and the birds in the Mojave Desert. So let's start with the small mammals. There's 34 species. Each dot here is a species. Over here, you're seeing the proportion of sites that these species occupied when Grinnell and his colleagues were surveying, corrected for the detection probabilities, and likewise, our modern occupancy, corrected for the detection. So those species, for example, would have been found at about 20% of the sites that Grinnell surveyed and about 20% of the sites that we resurveyed. Here's the one-to-one line. All the gray dots indicate species that didn't change significantly in the proportion of sites they occupied. The blue ones show sites of species that increased in their occupancy. The red ones show species that declined. Overall, for the mammals, there's very little change, but not for the birds. You can see most all of the species are well below this one-to-one line. And in fact, 39 out of 135 species declined significantly. This is like a major shift in the diversity that's in these protected areas. And a lot of other species, they declined, but it wasn't significant, partly because the historic data were a bit uncertain. Only one species increased. And yep, it was the common raven, probably the smartest, most adaptable, wide-ranging species in the desert. So this we call the community collapse. We're just seeing a whole different baseline. And you see it when you go to a site. When we go to a site now, on average, they lost 42% of the species that Grinnell would see there. Holy cow, look at this shift in the baseline, but not the mammals. The mammals, on average, gained 2 species a site and lost 2 species a site. So with the exception of only a couple of sites, there was very little change in the number of species that occupy them. So this this is really kind of startling. Same region, same climate change, strong overlap in the habitat, really different responses from the two taxa that are homeothermic, that control their own body temperatures. And so it made us start to think about, how did the exposure to climate change for these two taxa differ? So here we got birds in the daytime, they're most active. They're getting direct solar sunlight pounding them. They get some reflection of the heat off the ground. They get some long wave radiation. All of these are ways that the body of a bird absorbs this energy. And some of it still affects them, even if they're in the shade. They're just not getting the direct sunlight. But the small mammals are underground during the day, during the hottest part of the day. And so their temperature that they're being exposed to is much lower. Most small mammals, not all, but most are nocturnal. And so at that point in time, they're no longer getting most of the direct sunlight. They're just getting this long wave radiation. And it's true that the nighttime temperatures have increased, but not nearly the kind of, probably the kind of load that we would expect to see for these birds. So Eric Riddell, who was a postdoc in my lab, recently started a position at Iowa State University. He did work in environmental physics. And so we said, well, let's see if we could come up with a way to measure how much water birds and mammals would need to cool themselves, cooling requirements, with a general equation that we could try to fix for each species. And that's what Eric did. It's kind of complicated. I'm not going to go through all of the math that goes into trying to figure out how much heat a bird's body is being subjected to, or a mammal's body is being subjected to. But I will say that we had to go back to the museum and measure a bunch of things about these birds or small mammals in order to get this. So we had to measure their mass, how big they were, their feather length, the insulation depth, how much energy the feathers absorbed, things like that, in order to actually get a good measure of this. And here's 3 bird species. Here's a lesser goldfinch you might see in your garden, a cactus wren you're probably not, and a mourning dove you might have been woken up by this morning. And these were the things we had to measure about each specimen on sometimes their ventral side, that's their bottom, or sometimes the top side. You can see that species differ in these characteristics. And from that, we would make a sort of a measure of how much cooling would they need. And the cooling is the amount of water that they would sort of need to either pant if they're a bird, or perhaps perspire if they're a small mammal, in order to cool their body during a warm day. Not the hottest day, just a warm day in the Mojave. And during the breeding season. And so you can see it, as you get bigger, you have to expire more water to cool yourself. We then kind of validated these models. This was what we predicted from our model. This was observed from other people's studies under controlled conditions in the laboratory. And the model does a pretty good job of predicting this water demand for cooling. When we look at the birds, their cooling costs are 3 times the mammals. Birds in red, the mammals in blue. Most mammals don't have much cooling costs because they're not exposed to that level of climate change or the climate during the day. And if we look at the change in these cooling costs since Grinnell's time, wow, the change is much higher for the birds than it is for the small mammals. So climate change is resulting in an increase in cooling costs for these birds, and they're probably not keeping up with it. And the last bit of this connection is to then connect the cooling costs to how much species declined in their occupancy. And you can see there's a relationship here. Species that declined more had severer declines in the proportion of sites that they disappeared from, had higher cooling costs, and likewise, or change in these cooling costs. And so it's really evident when you look at the carnivores and insectivores, and these are species that get all of their water from their food. So they would have to, we kind of calculate, they would have to get 3 times as much food to get the water they need now as what was required when Grinnell and colleagues were surveying the birds. So we think there's a good and an unusually strong connection here between the physiological needs of these birds and their decline that the mammals are not exposed to in the same region because of their different life history. Now, let's go to one more transformed landscape, the other land use. We've got some pretty transformed landscapes in California. Oh, we got everything in California, right? That's the great part of living here. Here's the Marysville Buttes, as they used to be called, or Sutter Buttes as we call them now, as they looked in 1931, and the same vision today. You know, there wasn't that much agriculture in the Central Valley prior to the Central Valley water projects. In the 1930s, there was some, but it especially expanded in the 1950s and onward. But there are still some places you can go to in the Central Valley and the region of Central Valley, including some of the foothills just up out of the valley like this, that look like they did when Grinnell was there. So we have a range of land use change. And then the most dangerous part of California, yep, LA. So, excuse me, going back a slide, Sarah McLean did her PhD work, completed this recently in the lab, and Sarah's work went to these transformed landscapes, starting down in LA and going up into the foothills and the mountains behind it. She even went to Grinnell's old neighborhood because Grinnell, as a teenager and young man living in Pasadena, kept bird censuses, and his notebooks were safely preserved in the museum. So here's the street where Grinnell grew up. Part of the reason why we hadn't done anything in these kinds of transformed landscapes before was the difficulty of measuring land use change. Sarah said, I can do this. I'm going back to the historic topo maps, and I'm going to hand digitize them so that I can get where urban areas were, where every house was, where every road was around the survey sites where she was resurveying. And she also found an old 1920s agricultural map for the Central Valley region that showed basically all the agricultural areas in California. And so we were able to get places where agriculture occurred as well as water surface. Here's the same site, by the way, 2018. Looks a little different. I'll flip back for a second. Okay, 1911. You can see the urbanization. Check out the bend here, the river. All right, here we are. 2018, pretty densely settled now, as they would say. So we did this to a bunch of sites in LA and Central Valley, 72 sites. And this top row, you can see here was the climate. Here's Central Valley climate, precipitation, Los Angeles, going up into the hills. And you can see that there's some overlap, but it was wetter, a little bit wetter in LA, a little bit hotter as well in the Central Valley and in LA. Not much difference in urban cover in those days, very little. Some sites in both places had agriculture, but on average, not a lot, and only a very little bit of surface water. And then down here in this row, you can see the change in precipitation. So the Central Valley has gotten a little bit wetter, whereas LA has gotten much drier. And the change in temperature, well, the Central Valley increased about 0.8. That's typical across the average increase of global temperature change. But Los Angeles, much warmer, almost twice as warm as that. And so we've got strong warming and drying here in LA. Urban cover greatly increasing in LA, some in the Central Valley. Agriculture cover increasing in Central Valley, decreasing in LA. But then, of course, surface water, some small changes there. All right, so what does this mean for the birds of this region? Now we have 145 species. They're mostly shared between these two regions. They share over 95%, and you can see a really different response. Here's the number of species here. Whoops, come back. Here's the number of species in this histogram that changed in occupancy. And here's the 0 line here. So species above this line expanded in the proportion of sites that they occurred in, and species below this line declined in the proportion. And on average, there was only about a 3% change in occupancy in the Central Valley. In fact, 23% of these species declined significantly in red. 61% showed no change, and about 16% increase. So it's almost a balancing here, not quite. That was surprising to us. LA, on the other hand, shows a major decline, about 15% on average change in occupancy, where 40% of the species decline, only 10% showing an increase. And if you go to a site now, it's almost like it was in Death Valley or parts of the Mojave. There's about a third less species per site in Los Angeles than there was in the early part of the century when Grinnell was down there keeping his bird list. Whereas the Central Valley shows no significant change. Just a couple more graphs before we finish up. This sort of shows the overall change, or the factors that affected how climate and land use both affect where species were found. Historically, over here, this is sort of a community measure. Okay, so this is 0. This would be like no effect. This is saying species were more likely to be found where there was a lot of precipitation. And in fact, there were a lot of species. Over this side of the graph shows the number of species that had a significant response or were significantly associated with precipitation, more likely to occur in areas of higher precipitation. So there were a lot of species. Some species were negatively related to precipitation, and that's what you expect across a broad community of species. Temperature secondarily was the most important factor affecting where species were found in the early 1900s in the Central Valley of California. And you can see there about equal number of species responding positively or negatively to what the temperature was like in those days. And very little effect of land use, actually a little bit of a positive effect for agriculture for a few species. Now, what's changed? Species colonized sites over the last century or persisted at sites over the last century. And precipitation turns out to be the most important factor, not temperature, the change in precipitation. So places that got wetter were more likely to be colonized, and species were more likely to persist there overall. Interestingly, places that became more urban also had a group of species that were quite happy to colonize those places. Some of them were non-native species that weren't around in Grinnell's time, but others were native species that came out of the foothills or elsewhere and expanded in their occupancy. And then likewise, if you look at the factors that affect persistence of species at a site since Grinnell was there, urbanization had the biggest negative influence. And secondarily, agriculture. Not so many species for agriculture, but wow, you can see a lot of species being negatively influenced, a few positively by urbanization. So if you look at how species were distributed in the early 1900s, climate was a key factor, and Grinnell was right. But if you look at now how species are being distributed in this region today, it's land use change that has had a big effect, and probably secondarily climate change. And this is what I've been working on most recently, trying to actually tease those things apart and take each species, that's what each of these dots are, and say to them, oh, what would happen if land use change occurred, but no climate change had happened in LA? What would happen if climate change occurred, but no land use change had happened in LA? You know, so some species are getting a double whammy. They're getting a negative effect of both climate change and land use change. And the colors here indicate species that decrease significantly in their occupancy in red, or green increased significantly, expanded since Grinnell's time, or blue didn't change. And you can see in LA, there's a strong pattern of these red dots with land use change. Probably no surprise there. But we do have some species that climate favored, but land use disfavored. And you can see that a lot of them were negatively affected by land use. Now let's come over to Central Valley. We see some of the same kind of thing, but more species having a windfall effect. There were still our double whammy species, negative effects of both things, but some species were happy to have agriculture and happy for the increased precipitation and maybe a little bit warmer weather. And so this is the kind of thing that I think is probably happening in many places. And that is a mixture of responses from species with climate change and land use change that may be interacting with each other. All right, let me just kind of conclude for a moment here. You know, I think what I've been talking about in thinking about how biodiversity is going to be affected by these global changes is it really depends on the regional exposure. You know, whether how much is the climate change, how much is the habitat changing, is there any buffering of this by the kinds of habitats that are there, like the small mammals? They were buffered by the microhabitats they used underground from a lot of that climate change. It also depends on their sensitivity. Are there certain things about their life history or their survival rates or reproduction that are going to be favored or disfavored by these changes? And then can they actually adapt? Can they make changes? Are they plastic enough? You know, there's been a lot of interest in phenology, that is species migrating sooner or breeding sooner to keep up with the changing climate. That's a way to stay in the same climate by starting everything sooner, by moving the schedule of their life history events earlier in time. All of these things, I think, are probably going to be important to determine what happens in California with our changing climate. When you look at our national parks, which we were fortunate enough to be able to spend time in doing these resurveys, many of them, you know, like the parks in the Sierras, they were doing their job. They're well connected through elevational corridors up and down, so species could move. They had climates that they could kind of escape into, or escape sort of in a north-south way. So since Grinnell's time, pretty good shape. Mojave, not so much. And there's some elevational change there, but even there's a limit to what you can escape from the heat and especially the lack of water in these extreme environments. So I used to think when I give these talks, I used to say that, well, the Arctic is ground zero for climate change. It's changing so fast, the ice is disappearing. Organisms that are so adapted to those places are having a hard time keeping up. But now, you know, especially in the last year or two in California, fires, droughts, I don't know, maybe we're starting to take over number one. We could argue about that. This is just to say that we're now have covered pretty much the entire state with this resurvey project, for the birds especially. The mammals, and we've mainly been in the Sierras and in the Mojave, but the birds we've been kind of everywhere. So now my job, fortunate enough to be a Miller Research Professor this year, is to put together a statewide view of what's changed for the birds, and also to use that to forecast what we think will change for the birds as time goes on. So again, I probably couldn't have done any of this work without the foresight of Grinnell and his army of students and collaborators that really helped create this historic baseline that we've been able to reconstruct. And without the support of a lot of good granting agencies, especially National Science Foundation, who's been an important partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Okay.
Steve.
Um,
Let us, take a few minutes for questions to form.
Paul, I'm not sure how you'd like to handle the question.
Well,
I'll read
I can read questions for you. Let me begin by a general.
Not hearing you. I can see you're speaking.
Oh, you can't see me? You can't hear me?
I can hear you, Paul.
Yeah. Steve, you can't hear me?
Maybe I need to turn something off on my computer because I'm not hearing questions. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing some then pop up in the chat from Peter. Oops. All right. Oh, I lost it now.
So Steve, can you hear us yet?
Steve, can you hear us?
I know. There we go. There we go. Now I can hear.
Okay. Let me just, before we get into the questions, comment on or ask one thing. You're talking about the presence or absence of species, whereas a lot of us, when we go out, we're more aware of the numbers, because rarely do you see a rare animal there's only one or two of them around, and you're aware that the numbers have dramatically changed. Do you deal,
Can we deal
presumably
with
Grinnell had some comment on abundance, didn't he?
Yeah, numbers turn out to be harder for a couple of reasons for us. One is that, well, first, abundance is something that goes up and down a lot in nature. You know, it can fluctuate a lot. Small mammals especially are really famous for these, you know, really high density years, low density years. Whereas whether or not a species is there, occupancy is something that doesn't change so much. You really only need a few individuals to be able to say a site is occupied. And in a way, occupancy is a sort of the first step. It's like local extinction. You can think of it that way. So abundance is a proxy on the way to local extinction, you know. And unfortunately, the field notes are not in good enough. They don't provide enough detail for us to be able to do much with abundance. We've thought about it with the small mammals because they trapped the small mammals, and they usually told us how many they trapped. But we have a little problem with the small mammal trapping historically, which was it was sampling without replacement. So they collected them, which makes it a little bit harder to actually kind of model how many were there actually there, you know, because we can't recount the same individuals on multiple days. So we kind of stayed away from abundance. But you're right, abundance is the stepway to changes in occupancy. And in the end, extinction takes place when the last site becomes unoccupied.
Zero is zero.
Zero is zero, yeah, exactly.
Well, Peter Rausch asks a very relevant question, and that is, how does this animal story compare with what's being revealed by the botanists? I know Ackerley has done a lot of this similar modeling and so on.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting and also pretty variable. So the Mojave, for example, let's go to the Mojave Desert. One of the most recent concerns has been the Joshua trees. And you've probably heard about that. Joshua trees are not doing a good job of reproducing. And there's real concerns that with climate change, the Joshua trees will not be able to replace themselves, and that their geographic range, that is their occupancy, is now declining. What's fascinating, I think, for the bird mammal comparison is the fact that you've got this two different taxa in the same region responding really quite differently to the same level of climate change, but not the same level of exposure to that climate change. So with the plants, you know, again, it's sort of assumed that all individuals of those floras are being exposed in the same way to that changing climate, and using you know, what David has done with his colleagues is use those species distribution models I talked about at the beginning, and change the precipitation and change the temperature and see where that might push the plants around, if they can get there. And so that's, you know, those forecasts, I think, have been a useful first step. And now the question is going to be, well, what about those plants? Can they do some things phenologically, for example, to adjust? Will they have the adaptive capacity to be able to stay in place and tolerate? Or will they experience those local extinctions and maybe even be replaced by something further south coming north?
Well, actually, the plant question raises another issue, or highlights the fact plants don't move the way animals move, and mammals don't have the mobility of birds.
Yep.
How does that factor into this picture?
To these pictures. No, and that's exactly right. So movement is going to be a key for many species to be able to go to new regions that have now become climatically suitable for them. And some plants move pretty good with the wind. You know, some birds move plants pretty well, actually, too, by eating their seeds and dispersing them. You know, other plants with bigger seeds, not so much, right? So they'll be the ones. And it's really quite interesting. I think in the plant end, something that's fascinated me has been the response of industrial forestry to climate change. The industrial foresters, especially those in the north, in Washington State and Canada, have recognized their climate is changing. So if they're planting species now and not harvesting for another 50 or 100 years, they need to be thinking about the future climate that's going to maximize growth. And so many of them are changing what they're reforesting their forests with to species that are more going to be more favored by that future climate. Now, I would say as a profession, forestry has not been you know, necessarily the most forward-looking or radical in its thinking, but there's no "do you believe in climate change or not" issue here. It's like, what's my climate gonna be like in the future for what's gonna grow here? And so they've recognized that they need to make those shifts. So they're, in a way, forcing the migration. They're moving these species up to these places. And people have talked about that with animals as well, or plants, moving them to places that are going to be becoming more climatically suitable for them. And that's fascinating. With the birds, you know, in the Mojave, we have birds down there. You'd think, well, maybe they're just leaving the Mojave Desert. Maybe it's just no longer that suitable for them, so they're not returning as much. And that's possible. We did not see a difference in the rate of decline of resident species and migratory species. And you know, a lot of the species there, they're not highly desert adapted. You know, yeah, you do have your cactus wrens and your roadrunners, but you've got your mourning dove and your American robin, which is the typical bird that's found everywhere, you know. So so it's really quite fascinating, the changes that have taken place there. It's also obviously not like a food web crash, because if it was, we expect the mammals small mammals to show that same kind of decline, but we didn't see that either.
Well, I guess the issue will be who will be around in 100 years to continue this and to
Well,
see if your predictions are correct.
no, that's right. I mean, we fully recognize and we fully expect that this resurvey will be repeated in 25 or 30 years when climate change is really kicking in, right? I mean, it's already seems to be kicking in faster than we had anticipated,
Yes.
but when it's full-fledged, yeah, I expect people will be repeating them. And we've been really good at connecting two dots in time with a straight line. So what actually happens in the
Third
future,
dot.
that
The
third dot, third
Okay.
dot, like the will be interesting. So
Thank you. Are there any other? There's time for a few more questions if anyone has any. Well, here's a good one. Peter follows up. So are there any really big lessons learned about how to proceed?
yeah, so one of the things that's been quite interesting is, of course, these declines in the birds in the Mojave, they took place without any knowledge. We had no idea. We had no expectation of this when we went there. And the birds surveyed much faster. We can survey the birds much faster than the small mammals. So we got through with that and published that sooner. And when we analyzed mammals last year and saw a very different response, we were quite surprised. So the first big lesson is to not expect that climate change is going to be the same everywhere, and that even in the same location, the taxa are going to be responding differently. So the second is that from the park's perspective, what could we do? This is a tougher one, for example, in the Mojave. You can't really change local climate change, but you can help create more refugia from it. So surface water probably going to be pretty important. So the park needs to be a lot more vigilant about permits in the region around the park for harvesting groundwater out of that area. That's been a big issue over the last 50 years. Devil's Hole pupfish is right there. That really created a major environmental law in the Endangered Species Act in the 1970s because the water level, the groundwater level had been reduced down so much. So in the park, another thought is, well, could we add surface water to some regions now where a lot of the springs are dry, what they used to be? And there are some things called guzzlers that kind of attract water near the ground and sort of funnel it so that there would be some surface water instead of losing it. Well, that's a little controversial in a way. That's a question of how much do you want to sort of manage in a non-natural way to offset this climate change. So that's another issue that's being discussed. In the Sierras and in many parts of California, it's going to be the linkages, as you were alluding to, Paul, things being able to move around. We have to have the habitat linkages for that to occur. Maybe not so much for a lot of the birds, but certainly for the mammals, for many of the amphibians and reptiles, it's going to be important too.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. If there are no further questions, it's fascinating to have long-term, except our long-term is pretty short over evolutionary time.
Oh, revolutionary
So there's a lot of, whether we'll have time to find out what happens next, we don't know.
That's right. You know, there are two kinds, I think, of long-term studies. One have been studying individual species like we've done with our parrot studies in Venezuela for 30 plus years. And then the other, these snapshots, where you get a cross section of a whole community. I think they're both equally valuable.
Yes. Well, thank
Thanks,
you
Paul,
again.
and thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank you all for attending.